Welcome to the Morse Code Podcast, where we talk with entrepreneurially minded creatives in music, film, and writing. My name's Corby, and I'm hoping these conversations inspire you to push deeper into your own work, whether you're a full-time professional or just starting out on your own creative odyssey. My next guest is the author of one of the most anticipated novels of the year. The author is Adam Ross, and the novel, Playworld, is experiencing something of a tidal wave of enthusiasm from outlets everywhere. The Washington Post said the book is, quote, so good, it will give readers hope for the year ahead. Extraordinary, writes the LA Times, and the Boston Globe says Playworld thrills with Gen X nostalgia. Set in 1980s New York, Playworld follows a year in the unusual life of Griffin Hurt, a child actor, prep school 8th grader, aspiring wrestler, and potential love interest of one Naomi Shah, who's a friend of his parents and a woman of some 20 years his senior. I won't add to the surfeit of reviews and summaries, which you can find very easily, but I will say that as an avid reader and lifelong fan of literary fiction, Playworld was one of the best books I've read in a long time. I had a similar feeling when many years ago I read a book called Mating by Norman Rush. In both cases, I was seized with this conviction that there's just nothing going around that touches this book. The ambition, the dancing language, the imagination of it. Also, and I just want to say this, the book has a lot of heart. In addition to being the author of a deadly piece of fiction, Adam's been the editor of the Sewanee Review since 2016. So I'll just be frank, I was a little nervous for this interview, enamored as I was with the book, and I will admit a little intimidated by the man's command of his craft. Thankfully, in spite of everything, I think we had a pretty revealing and even entertaining conversation, at the close of which I got Adam to read one of my favorite passages from Playworld aloud, which was Chef's Kiss. If you get something out of the Morse Code Podcast, please press whatever button on your interface connotes with the internet's universal language of approval. And now here's my conversation with Adam Ross. Adam Ross, it's so exciting to have you here in the studio, man. Thanks for making some time with me. And congratulations on Playworld.
Thank you.
Man, I got to say, it looks like by every indication, the early indications are very positive.
It's been exciting to get such good notices.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And when this will air, I think on the 9th, so the book will have dropped 2 days ago on the 7th.
Yes.
So by the time this airs, you will be already in the circus of...
I will be in the circus.
The extroverted side of the writing life.
The extroverted side of writing.
Are you looking forward to that?
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Because, I worked on this for so long. I worked on this for a decade. And so there is something that is much more satisfying than shilling. You're not shilling. You're in conversation with your readers, and you get a chance. I mean, frankly, you just get a chance to have conversations like these. I mean, where it's such a lonely business for such a long period of time that in some ways you might well be chomping at the bit to be in conversation with somebody about something you've lived with privately. And then I'll also say there's this other level where your book goes out into the world and it's really not yours anymore. I mean, there's a way in which it's kind of like a toddler on a plane. You know what I mean? It is just walking around, encountering people, and only to a certain degree can you rein that thing in because it has its own life. And so in some ways, I guess what I'm saying is your book gets given back to you.
Yes.
Your book gets given back to you by the people who respond to it, and they end up teaching you about it, because you can't, when you're writing, I think one of the most frankly wondrous and also spooky things about writing a book is a novel. Is that unquestionably your unconscious is in operation. And in fact, I'd argue that the more unconscious you are about certain aspects of the process, the more surprised you are as you're moving through the book, the more your higher brain is making connections of which you're not aware. So I recently I did the audiobook. I performed the audiobook. And
there's a clip on your social media, on your Instagram. That's you reading it.
That's me reading it. That's actually not from the audiobook, but by then I was practiced. And because if you perform an audiobook, you'll get practice.
It's difficult.
It's very demanding.
You have a voice suited to it, though.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But the amazing thing about the experience, there were a lot of amazing things about that experience, but it was the first time that the book was really disclosed to me in a way that it was defamiliarized enough that I could, after I got beyond just hearing my own voice, which I think for some authors would make them want to puke.
Yeah.
I could hear the book continuously. Mm-hmm. And because I could hear the book continuously, I was like, oh, I never noticed that connection. We were talking before taping about Griffin and invisibility. And, later on, as I was writing the book, I started seeing that there were these patterns of that in the book. Later on in the book, Griffin sort of calls himself a cuttlefish, a camouflaging fish. But like in that first scene with Naomi, who's such a central character, he hears somebody rapping on glass as he's walking down a New York street, and he looks at this car on his right and he sees his reflection in her Mercedes, and then the window goes down and he disappears. And those are the kinds of things. That's sort of what I mean about the kind of like spooky action aspect of it, is you're like, oh, like there was this plot element right from the jump of Griffin being disappeared.
And you didn't recognize that in the moment of writing it.
You don't recognize it. And I think, and again, I think for me, as somebody who, takes a while to produce things, getting hip to those things, becoming conscious of those things at a time one hopes it's the right time to become conscious of them. When, there's a period in which I think the surprise you experience in narrative, like the very propulsion in good stories, right, is to me inextricably linked with the author experiencing the same surprise as the reader. The author is experiencing, I think, the same surprise as the reader because the author is discovering the story as he or she writes the book.
That's a great segue to this question that I want to bring up, which is that whenever I'm reading a book, there's one of the questions I'm asking myself as I write is to what extent was the author a gardening type versus an architecture type? To what extent did the author plot this book out and is merely connecting the dots? And to what extent is the writer writing to discover? And as I was reading this book, I found myself asking that question over and over again because it feels very much like a gardening project.
Interesting.
But there are elements of callback. There are, it is a substantiated whole. And so my question to you is, to what extent did you think through where the story was, where Griffin's character was going, where he would end, or rather, did you just get in with these characters and see what happened?
That is such a great question. So, needless to say, when you work on something for 10 years, the exact nature of the process gets a little muddled. But what I will tell you is something that has endured in my process with, whether it was with Mr. Peanut, with my short stories, and certainly with this book, is I have what I like to call emotional coordinates. I have these There are not many of them. I actually, somewhere in my notes, have a list. It literally is a list of about 12 things. Mm-hmm. And it's like, Naomi in front of Juilliard, the terrible weekend at Amanda's, Griffin's father getting the role of a lifetime. They're just these certain points where I'm like, okay, the novel has to get to that point and that point and that point and that point. And the challenge, I would say generally speaking, the challenge is twofold. One is creating the ligature between those points, the connective tissue between those points, pick your trope. And then the other is finding the voice. Because once you find the voice for the book, and that was something I really struggled with. I would say I struggled for over a year with this, like finding the actual voice of the book, to the point where I was in despair and I thought I'd have to abandon it.
How far were you in there before you were really thrashing around and worried?
I'd sold the book based on like 70 pages that never appear in the book.
Okay.
And I had cashed that check.
Yes, totally. You're on the hook for this.
I was like buying groceries with that check.
Yeah.
And it was kind of like, like I'm in trouble here. And I remember talking with someone very close to me at the time and was in a state of despair about this. And I said, I don't know. I can't find my way into this book. Because I'd originally seen it as a 3-act structure. Mm-hmm. And I had this great first act. And I was like, I can't find my way into this book. And the person was like, well, tell me about it. Like, tell me this. And I was like, well, it was like, I'm trying to write about when I was a child actor in New York and I was surrounded by adults constantly. And, I was the only kid on set a lot of times. And they would say things to me that were like wildly inappropriate. And I would just kind of like listen to it and absorb it, and I had this wrestling coach and, I had this, fucked up affair with this person. And it didn't seem strange at the time. And the person was like, that's a really good line. And I was like, oh, wait. And I literally went upstairs to my study and wrote, in the fall of 1980, when I was 14, a friend of my parents named Naomi Shah fell in love with me. She was 36, a mother of 2, and married to a wealthy man. Like so many things that happened to me that year, it didn't seem strange at the time. And I swear, I have this journal where I wrote those lines where it says, we have liftoff. Like I had the voice. So I had the voice that could power me through those interstitial periods, or create the connective tissue between those moments that I've described. Mm-hmm. And those moments that I've described, those emotional coordinates, again, I'm pulling tropes out of the air, or figures out of the air, but they're a map. I mean, they end up becoming a map of a big dramatic arc. There's an alpha point and there's an omega point, and again, so it's segmented. You're like, okay, like X has happened, like he's met Naomi. We've introduced the wrestling coach. His father gets tapped for this part in this musical. Now we have to get to this part. And you don't necessarily know the broader elements of architecture. Mm-hmm. So I'd actually say to use your own figures, there's, especially because I've been doing this for a long time. So I'd say architecture and gardening are in conversation. Mm-hmm. Like sometimes you're gardening, and sometimes, depending on how conscious you are of what you're doing or where you are in the process, then you can start really thinking in terms of architecture. And then what we can do is we can further parse that, where, then you get to, let's say, jumping way ahead, like the editing process. And when you're in the editing process, you're like, ooh, we don't need that dormer window. Let's get rid of that. Or you step back from the garden and you're like, yeah, too many azaleas, you know what I mean? And that is a conversation. I saw in one of your podcasts, I think you were talking just about endurance, stamina. And that's where the stamina comes in. Cause you gotta sit with this thing for a long time as you figure out your way to through those coordinates.
Yeah. You wrote in, a post not very long ago about this encounter with the great writer James Salter, who wrote A Sport and a Pastime, among other things, which shout out to Josh Parkey for introducing me to that book. And you'd met him and he'd said something about, I guess he was in the Air Force originally. He said, if you're a pilot in the Air Force, you're a rock star from moment one. I'm paraphrasing. Right. And then you went on to say that, that the fact is that when you're a writer, you're nobody until you're somebody.
That's right.
And you learned nothing. You had a nice phrase, the fog of composition. You have no idea when you're in the middle of a long form narrative how well it's working or not working. You can't be your own judge. It's a terrible, terrible situation. I'm almost at the end of my first draft of my first novel, and I'm in utter despair. So at some point I'm going to fling myself at you and ask for all kinds of advice. It's difficult.
It's a hard time.
It's a hard time. It's a hard time on this end of the table. But what I wanted to get at was you closed that little caption by saying this pithy little quote: "The only thing you learn from finishing a book is how to finish a book." I think there's probably nothing truer you could say. And also, it's not exactly an encouragement to all the aspiring writers out there. And maybe to put a question to this, I also familiarized myself with Mr. Peanut after the fact, just to kind of get a sense of what connects these two books, if anything. And it's not obvious. I would say tonally, there's the same kind of through line of humor throughout, although in Mr. Peanut, the humor is edged and a bit of snark to everything.
Sure.
And in Playworld, it's not like that. It's absolutely earnest, I would say.
I agree with you.
And so maybe this is a way of saying, was there anything you learned from writing Mr. Peanut that applied to Playworld? If you could reach all the way back there and remember.
I learned how to finish a book. I mean, going back to that, post you mentioned, it's on my Instagram. You set out to do this thing. Well, it's really funny. I call it fog of composition. Obviously I'm nodding to fog of war. Because of course you go into your novel, you're at the beginning and you're really excited. You're like, man, I'm going to write the great American novel right now. I'm just I've got it going on. And then fog of composition, cuts you out at the knees, chops off your arms. It's just the most humbling, miserable, state of lostness, I think, that you can be in for a time. And so
that is a comfort.
Yeah. Thank you. That's what I'm here for.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's what I'm here for. But I think that if you're writing something that has integrity, and by integrity, I mean in the sense that it holds together, even though you might not know in your first draft state how it holds together. If it holds together, you have to really hold on to it, push through, move through those dark periods, all those words you're never going to use, to start to discern what exactly it is you're doing. I'll give you one of my favorites. These are things I've sort of made up for myself to comfort myself in the dark hours. Wonderful. But one is I've started to think of writing the novel as you're in a completely pitch dark cave, and you're in some kind of gigantic chamber, some gigantic cavern. And in this pitch darkness, you come upon an enormous statue. And then you spend the next X number of years, months, whatever, feeling the contours of this statue, which is already wholly made, like a blind person feels a face. And that image you create based on feeling that pitch dark statue, which you will never see, which is the ideal version of your book. That imaginative rendering of this thing that's already there, that's your novel.
I find it an enormous comfort knowing that every attempt will fall short, just by the virtue of it's being attempted, and that is to just agree with you. I'm in violent agreement with that image, because it is like this dim inclination I have to tell this particular story. It's a beautiful phrase,
by the way, a dim inclination. I love that.
Well, I probably appropriated it from T.S. Eliot or something, the hints and guesses in his quartets. Anyway,
dim inclination is good.
Okay, cool. Well, you will fall short, and the attempt is, you just make the attempt as good as it can possibly be, knowing that it won't be right.
Joseph Conrad talks about that in one of his introductions. I feel remiss not recalling which one exactly, but Joseph Conrad did a series of introductions in his body of work to quite a few of his novels. And in one of them, he talks about, not only does he talk about falling short of that ideal, and that is almost both the curse and the permanent aspirational aspect of being a writer. But then he also makes it a dramatic / thematic part of his work in The Secret Sharer. And, The Secret Sharer is about a guy who, basically when he's first the captain of a ship, lets on a stowaway who's a kind of doppelganger. But one of the things he says that sort of becomes a question that the entire narrative asks is, I wanted to see if I matched up to my ideal self, my ideal sense of self. And I mean, you know what I mean? Like, in other words, I have this idea of myself as X, a great seaman, but will the living of that ideal, will the living of that occupation show that I fall short of that? Or will I actually, is my ideal sense of self, is it corroborated by how I handle myself? And, that's kind of the patience game of again, writing a novel, because, you have these, as I said, you have these moments that you really wanted to get to, that pull you forward, and then you're like, okay, I'm gonna bring all of my game to rendering these things and make them as beautiful and as moving as they have been to me for so many years, because they've been like lodestars. I've been dwelling on these things. When I have been thinking about writing Playworld since I was a staff writer, special projects editor at the Nashville Scene. I used to have that title like taped above my computer that just said Playworld. But what did I know at that time? I was not ready to write, to tell some of those stories. So, this is like early aughts.
Yeah. That is a great segue to this kind of observation / question, which is one of the things that I'm so, why I come back to reading novels over and over again, is because they are, in their very existence, an answer to a great question. That's the only reason to write a novel, I think. And it's really difficult to find a subject like the one Conrad wrote about, is a worthy subject to devote that kind of effort, time, word count toward answering. And I have a feeling of what I feel like the question being posed by Playworld is, but I wonder if you would put a few words toward that, or would you rather say, should I say what my impression is?
Going back to where we started this conversation, I'd love to hear yours.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll hear yours first, and then I'll either riff on it. By the way, if it's really good, I'll be like, oh yeah, that's right. That was my question.
That'll be a feather in my cap if it is.
The whole time, Corby.
Well, I think there's a lot of themes going on. One is the tension between filial loyalty and one's personal desires. Okay, so
100%.
Griffin is so torn between fulfilling his father's wishes, and that relationship is so fraught and complicated and interesting because
and loving.
Well, and that's why I was kind of saving the best for last.
Griffin adores his father.
And I feel like one of the things that's so attractive about this novel, I was about to use the word mature, but that seems like a strange thing to put toward an author a little bit older than me. Who am I to say? But there's not an antagonist in this book, except perhaps in Keppelman.
The wrestling coach.
Even Keppelman has sort of redeeming qualities. You see, like, this guy really, I think he does root for his kids. Whatever. That's maybe all I'll say about that right now. I don't want to give away any spoilers, but by and large, the people that fill the world of Playworld are looked upon affectionately. Is that a fair observation?
Absolutely. I want to do this though, because I think it's sort of important, especially in a novel this big, which is just when I say big, I mean like just this long. I'm gonna give the quickest synopsis. I mean, what is Playworld about? Playworld is about a really formative, consequential year in the life of this child actor, Griffin Hurt. It begins when he's 14 years old and it ends when he's 15. It takes place in 1980, end of the Carter administration, beginning of the Reagan administration. And it's about a series of things that happen to him and a series of choices that are presented to him over the course of this year, which build toward, the question that he has to answer, which maybe what the question you thought maybe it was, is like, is he going to continue acting? Because if he continues acting, it looks like really good things are going to come to him, or at least good things in the sense of how Americans think of good things. Wealth, fame. Prosperity, yes. Wealth, fame, and all of its attendant pleasures. One of the questions you asked earlier, what connection do I see between Mr. Peanut, and I'd add, ladies and gentlemen, and this book, and it's something I'm really obsessed with. It's bound up in one of the therapist Eliot's aphorisms. Griffin is seeing, the whole family sees this therapist named Eliot, and in some ways, Eliot is like, he's both he's a brilliant therapist for adults, but he's kind of a shitty therapist for a kid. And I would say that over the course of the novel, he either becomes a better therapist with Griffin, or Griffin grows up enough that Griffin's adult-ish enough that they can actually talk to each other, because they don't. But one of the things Eliot says is, one of Eliot's aphorisms, I mean, I made these up, but I love this one, is if life is cyclical, lengthen your diameter. And so, if we struggle to change, or we keep circling around certain kinds of struggles, maybe make the circle as big as possible. So I would say that one of the things I've always been obsessed with, and this is true in Mr. Peanut again, and the other works of fiction, is to what degree are we capable of change, of slow evolution, and to what degree does the past exert either a regressive or just inertial pull on our characters, and we can't change. And I think if you thought about the novel in those terms, and again, this was not something where I'm like, pegboard. But I do find that I cycle around this as maybe like a central theme. I would say that, whereas Mr. Peanut's about marriage and about cyclicality in marriage, and those are local problems, right? Mm-hmm. Playworld does have this political dimension. Playworld is trying to talk about America in these terms. Mm. So, because I did a lot of research into these things, and I do think about the question about how much America has changed. And it's funny, one of the greatest things that was said to me, one of my young editors at the Swanee Review, where I'm the editor, he read it, and he's young, he's in his mid-20s. And he said, in spite of all the technological change, in spite of like the way in which so much of life is digital, and all the ways in which life right now doesn't look like necessarily life in the 80s, he said, has nothing changed since 1980? Mm-hmm. And I think partly what he was talking about was the political discourse. Mm. So these are things that, that's a really central theme of mine, I would say.
How much things stay the same, and in spite of the changing circumstances that hold them? Well, I mean, to make this, to ground this in character, and without spoiling things, right? Lily, Griffin's mother, and Griffin's father go through this very brutally difficult time in their marriage over the course of the novel. And they are faced with splitting up. I'm not going to say what they decide to do, but their respective reasons for making the choice they make makes you, the reader, I hope, ask, like, okay, like, in a marriage like that, is the decision that they made one which is pro-change, or is it inertial? Meaning, is it just like, well, this will never change, and I'm just going to not even settle, but accept, right? Mm-hmm. So that, and then, I already mentioned one of these things, which is the evolving relationship between Griffin and his therapist Elliot, which is the evolving relationship between Griffin and his abusive wrestling coach, which is the evolving relationship between Griffin and Naomi, and is the evolving relationship between Griffin and his brother. Mm. I mean, they, if I had to hope this novel was successful, it is, I hope, successful in showing where we live our life in terms of our desire to change, to be better people, to understand people better, to accept people, to understand that some people that maybe initially come off as either evil or destructive are never wholly bad. Mm-hmm. I mean, you mentioned Keppelman, the wrestling coach, mm-hmm. who does horrible things, mm-hmm. not just to Griffin, but to the other kids. Mm-hmm. But it's Keppelman who has some abiding forms of wisdom to teach this kid. Mm-hmm. I wasn't conscious of this, but I do think that in a lot of literature today, I think that the tag it's been given is trauma porn. But I don't, and maybe it's my own Generation X upbringing, but and Griffin talks about this in the book. Like, I don't think we're reducible to our traumas. And I don't think people are reducible to their worst selves or their best selves, right? And it's something that our culture has wrestled with, certainly over the last 45 years, and then really certainly acutely during Me Too.
right? I mean, like where some very bad things came to light, and there was a cultural conversation about that, and then blowback and reaction or reactionary responses, and here we are, right? I mean, so
yeah, I think it's fair to say that however you feel about the Me Too movement, I think that most decent people feel like it was a good thing and in a long time coming.
Absolutely.
Right? And then maybe there's a blowback against it, but on the whole, America's better off having gone through it. How could you? I don't know. I feel that way, and I think that
unquestionably
that is the obvious.
Unquestionably, I mean, here you have a character, Griffin, who, in terms of certain kinds of abuse, has it coming and going, but it's interwoven with so much dynamism, by which I mean he's just, he's a young kid. Like these things happen at warp speed. He's just trying to survive and thrive in this particular milieu. And so, I mean, this seems sort of out of left field, but another thing I really was trying to accomplish in the novel was for some of these things, for the reader to experience some of these things happening to him, and not so much having Griffin take a moment and be like, oh, that was really terrible. That really was destructive. But more for the reader to be like, oh, that's going to leave a mark. That's going to be something Griffin's going to think about for the rest of his life.
There's that really haunting scene when Keppelman takes him into the wrestling mat
the
underneath
dungeon.
The dungeon.
Yeah.
That's a harrowing scene. And what I feel like its power is in the, surprise, surprise, in the showing, not the telling. It's Griffin's. It's also like kind of oblique imagery, and it's glancing blows. It's really effective writing.
What Keppelman is doing to Griffin and his teammates, none of them fully understand.
Yeah, and that's so great. I mean, that's one of the powers of the book to me, is that as adult as Griffin is and isn't, there's still a fundamental innocence at which he looks at the world.
Yes,
and
which is part of his resilience. Mm-hmm. It's what allows Griffin, in some of these terrible things you're describing, to just keep going. And it's funny how, again, like about how the culture right now talks about this. I think there's a lot of, and this was something I really wanted to write about, which is the style of parenting of that era, the way in which Gen X kids were parented, and the freedom that Gen X kids had. And what I really feel like is the resilience that got built into our characters because of that. Now, that does not mean that I'm going to let my daughters loose on the world to the degree that I was. But what's funny is that my daughters, when I speak about my New York life at that time, when I was getting to school on my own in first grade, going to clubs like Studio 54 in 8th grade. And, I think the first time I got mugged was 5th grade. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, was when I was 5. I mean, just like these crazy things that were happening to us in Manhattan at those times. My daughters, they romance that. They're like, oh my God, like,
I'm sure they do.
That was awesome.
Yeah.
Like for you to have that kind of freedom, but, then there's that element of, did you survive? And so, that was something I wanted to write about as well.
Yeah. I mean, part of probably my joy in reading this book is I'm Gen X also. And so even though I grew up in the potato patch in Idaho, but I had the same freedom. Phone-free freedom. Mine was
phone-free freedom.
Yeah, which is, I wouldn't have traded for the world. I mean, obviously it was the world was more innocent in its way, and we can't go back to those times. We're not going to raise our kids the way that we were raised. It's not possible. But it's difficult not to romance that aspect of life.
you have
from
to be
this distance.
And you have to be careful about that, right? You have to be careful about nostalgia. I mean, like, to me, the check against nostalgia for me in Playworld is the violence. Mm-hmm. And the check is just the danger and the people that they encounter, and how there should be in certain moments throughout the book. I mean, I hope this was the case for you, but there should be a kind of dread attending some of these moments, like when they go and meet that guy in Central Park. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, you know, there's no safety net.
That's so funny. I didn't have any sense of dread in that moment, and it was because of the kind of the whimsy that set that all up. Like, they're making these prank calls, and then this guy kind of turns the tables on him, and it's like, whoa, this guy. And then they kind of like meet the call, you know, and then the little friends, it felt Goonies-y, you know, going to Central Park to meet this guy. And then he imparts these words of like kind of wonderful wisdom on them. And of course it's his Griffin's little brother, Oren, who seems to always have the upper hand from Griffin's perspective. He seems to know how to act. He seems to know what's up in a way that Griffin can't.
True.
And of course, Griffin's like, he hears the story this guy tells him, and
this allegory,
and Griffin is just kind of mystified and dumbfounded, and Oren's like, oh, I get it. You know? It's like...
Oren sees things as they are. Mm-hmm. That's why he's my favorite character in the book. He is the truth dealer. Lily, Griffin's mom, always tells the truth, but Oren sees through masks. I wanted to go back to this one thing. I love to tell this story. One of my, I was fortunate enough I won the Berlin Prize. And so my family and I, we lived in Germany. We lived in Berlin for 6 months. And of course, now Berlin, I mean, it's a monoculture. Okay. And, it's an extraordinarily safe, amazing city. My daughters were 9 and 7 at the time. And, I was leaving the academy, which is in the Wannsee. So that's like in the southwest of Berlin. And I'm walking to the Bahnhof. I'm walking to the train station. And here comes my 7-year-old daughter walking alone. And, Berlin's so awesome because, you can buy like, lo mein noodles, at the train station. And she's got her backpack on. She's eating lo mein noodles. And she's walking right toward me all alone. And I'm like, Lila, like, what are you doing? Like, where's your mom? Like, where's your sister? And Lila was like, well, they're in Zehlendorf, which is like 4 stops away. And I'm like, Zehlendorf? I'm like, what? Like, what are you doing? And she's like, I told mom I wanted to go home. So she was like, go get on the train and go home. And I had this moment where I was like, oh, I got to recreate my childhood for my daughter, except with safety. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Because so much of my experience in New York, I mean, the odysseys that my brother and I would sometimes have just getting to school on the crosstown bus, not a straight shot crosstown bus, but like a wending crosstown bus to get to our public school, and the stuff that we would see, or the bus would break down, and then the things we would encounter that weren't safe. No, I wouldn't trade the street smarts that gave me. I wouldn't trade the situational awareness that gave me, but I would never risk the violence that I experienced in some cases. And some of it was really extreme. I mean, like nearly life-ending stuff. And I mention this just because I think that, I mean, again, one of the things I hope that Playworld sparks a conversation about is how we're parenting. Mm-hmm. Because what's the big thing about parenting right now? Kids are anxious. They're depressed. They're holed up. They're not encountering the world. They're on their phones. We as Gen Xers know that the privilege of being able to go out in the world, to not knowing what FOMO was, because we didn't know where our friends were. Mm-hmm. We didn't know what we were doing that we weren't a part of. That is what, injected the adamantium into our spines, right? But I'd be shocked if you didn't occasionally pay a price, or have friends who died, or have friends who were hurt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, or just when you have, because you just had a kid, or just the times you'll think back as your kid gets older and older, and you're like, yeah, mom and dad never knew about X that happened. And I don't know if I can suspend disbelief and just let my kid go out and do that, because I know the choices I made and I'm lucky to be here.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I think about, I'm a new dad. I have a 4-week
Congratulations.
year old daughter. Thank you. It's so wonderful and sleepless, all the things that people say. But I also, obviously already revisiting this question of how do I want to parent, and having, there's kind of two things I want to ask about this. Well, I did just like you. I did a lot of things that I'm involved lying and doing what I wanted, and got away with a lot. And I had I was like a difficult child. I wanted to do what I wanted to do, and I got great grades, so you couldn't really complain too much. And but in particular, one year, my senior year of high school, I lied to my folks and said that I was going to go camping with my best friend for 7 days in the Sawtooths. And instead, we drove, my dad bought me a 68 VW bus. Stupid dad. And I instead drove to Eugene, which was 1,000 miles away, to go to the Grateful Dead show. And at the time, I was smoking pot in high school all the time. And just like, it was innocent in a weird way, right?
Sure.
And that week was a wake-up call for me of like, oh, hard drugs, seeing people that were burned out on acid. I was just like, this isn't as nice as I thought it might have been. On the way home, we were driving home from Eugene. We took a back road of Oregon, and long story short, we're the first people on a fatality crash of kids that were coming home from the same Dead show. And it was a life-changing experience. It was the first time I ever saw somebody die, and it was such a wake-up call.
Meaning sort of in the convoy you were in?
I didn't know the kids. No, this was such a rural stretch of road that it was like one car might pass every 60 seconds, right, kind of thing. And I didn't know them. We were just driving the bus. I was driving the bus, my best friend in the passenger seat, and a girl, you can see in the distance a long straight, there's a girl, somebody waving you down. And she had blood on her face, and she said, I've killed my friends. She was out of her mind. And we had, like, as we pulled over, I didn't even see the wreckage of the car that hit this enormous eucalyptus tree. And we got out, and I was like, still just frightens me to my core to tell this story 25 years later. Saw a young man my age take his last breaths. And it was the most terrifying, horrible thing, you could ever see. And all these decades later, I've tried to write about it and try to understand it better.
It's hard to write about those things because you try to write about those things and they exert this kind of emotional gravitational force. I mean, you think about them almost as like a black hole that makes it very hard again to get that lift I talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. You almost can't write directly at them. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know if you remember, but it seems like a throwaway moment in Playworld, but when they're with their cousins and they're playing flashlight tag and they're joined by those two kids, and Griffin flashes forward and he's like, this one kid would get, killed on the way home. Mm-hmm. And he just hit a tree. Mm-hmm. That's all. That's the only, it's intentionally injected there because the only thing shielding them from any sense of tragedy and this like lovely moment of innocence is time. Like these terrible things are always right there. Again, like I think that one of the hardest things and one of the conversations I hope we're going to start having as parents, because I think a correction is coming, a response is coming, is that our surveillance of our children, our hyper awareness of where they are, their lack of elbow room with respect to certain kinds of experiences do not necessarily serve them well. And then if you throw in the electronic component, the tech component. It becomes
the stats of life.
Well, I mean, again, where, how, and when do they play? And part of Playworld is about how vital unrestricted play is. I think about Griffin and wrestling in the novel, and wrestling is something he's extraordinarily passionate about. His parents have like freaking no involvement in it. Versus the way in which I, as a parent, with one kid in particular who, participates in organized sports, the downward pressure in order for your kid to compete in these kinds of sports, to do like travel lacrosse and off-season training. And God bless my younger daughter. She's like, no. And more power to her. But then she and her team get in front of some of these like powerhouse schools where every kid is a, travel player, and they're awesome. But what is it? I mean, like, again, it's like this kind of like hyper organized thing that is plugged into getting into college and getting ahead, and like, and has this like late capitalist element to it, which is just like a little bit soul killing, and kids are burned out or they're getting injuries that they never got in our era, and you're like, and again, like you see the differences, which was another thing I really wanted to get at. It's like,
you're familiar with the work of Jonathan Haidt?
I'm familiar with what word?
Jonathan Haidt. Are you familiar with his work?
No.
He is like sort of the guy right now who writes about the impact of social media on kids. He's got a number of really...
Oh, wait, didn't he write, what's his book?
The Righteous Mind is his most recent one, but Coddling Ourselves, the Coddling of the American Mind, I think is one that he co-wrote. But he's kind of like throwing out the latest round of terrible statistics of self-harm with teenage girls, especially vis-a-vis social media.
Sure.
And he has some neat anecdotes, bits of advice. He lives in New York. He has a young daughter, and they'll send her to go get bagels for the family around the block. And of course, she's on, the finder, the phone. They can see where she's at, but she's got the empowerment and the change, and she goes and pays for the bagels and brings it back just to teach the kid a little independence.
Oh my God.
Are
you kidding?
What do you mean? Are you kidding? You would never do that, or you would?
No. I mean, are you kidding? So I just saw, when I say, are you kidding? Like, it's sad to me.
That would be such a remarkable thing.
Like, it's like, will you go get the bagels? And like, I'm going to watch you. It's like, you're a block away. Is everything okay? Is everything okay? You know what I mean? I saw a story, I'm gonna totally mangle this, but I saw a story about like some Georgia woman. This just happened like within the last 2 weeks, where she had an errand to run, and she was just like, okay, they live in some rural area, and she was like, okay, like play outside, whatever. And the police showed up and arrested her. Yeah. For child endangerment. The kid was 10.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so I don't know.
Well, here's another question, but just to bring it back to Playworld. So the parents are sort of doing their own thing. The kids are doing their own thing.
Yes.
I didn't get the impression that Griffin's parents love him any less than you love your daughters.
Absolutely not.
And so how do you explain that, or what's your perspective or comment on that nature?
I just think, again, I think doing this first from the macro level, from the 30,000 foot view. I mean, I think all of us on a generational level have come to this fork in a road in our evolution, which is where we're like, okay, it happens. I'm spitballing here. It happens around like 32. It usually happens like when you're starting your own family, and you're gonna do a better job, and you're like, okay, like, I'm either going to spend the rest of my life pissed off at my parents, or I'm going to basically forgive them and acknowledge that they were doing the best that they were doing. My parents came out of a culture of even less, I think, attention, generally speaking, or certainly, let's say, one that is commensurate with our Gen X upbringing, where even in the 1970s and 80s in New York, you would just be like, go out and come home for dinner. Like there's this one moment in Playworld where Griffin's mom is like, Griffin comes home and she's like, did you sleep here last night? And he's like, no, I slept at, Tanner's, or it's the other way around. And, or she's like, did you sleep at Tanner's? But my point is that, I think that, to answer your question, I think that the way in which their love is expressed, the sort of touch points where they get a chance to connect with their kids is, again, not in the context of a generational correction that we're making with ours. Mm-hmm. We are so involved with our children. We are trying to respond to that roominess that we got, that we thought was at times, mildly abusive or just mildly, neglectful, benign neglect, as people like to say. But what that has led to is, what I would call just like an over-interpolation, where the parents who want to be their kids' best friends, the parents who are overly involved in their schooling, who don't let their kids fail, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Did my parents love me? Yeah. Was it even expected? Were they acculturated to be that attuned to what we were going through? No. Mm-hmm. Do I feel like they loved me? Yes. There is another pattern in Playworld, which I found to be, generally speaking, among my cohort, true, which is the parents were very much a world and a unit unto themselves. Like it was the moms and dads, the husbands and wives, and the kids were, sort of around them. Right. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like Griffin is very, I think, conscious as the book goes on that Griffin's father is his mother's numero uno. Mm-hmm. Right. He sees that with some of his friends where, in some cases the parents they're the unit and everyone else kind of like orbits around that unit. Whereas again, I think it's different. I have personally, getting really personal. I mean, I try to give my kids as much room as possible and as much agency as possible. And of course, the difference for me is, raising kids in Nashville is at 16, it's like, get in that car and off you go. Mm-hmm. which, when I look at myself, I didn't start driving until I was like 22 because I was in New York City. Mm-hmm. And when I think about myself as a 22-year-old driver, I'm like, yikes.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I mean, we're differently acculturated.
I wonder if we'd talk for a second about the literary scene as it is today, especially with regards to.
Is this me putting on my Swanee Review editor?
I think so. I don't know.
Okay.
And I don't even know if I can ask a decent question here, but it's something I am really interested in, which is what fiction can look like and how it's changed. Let me think about this. A series of books that made a big impact on me in the last 10 years was the Karl Ove Knausgaard, My Struggle books. Yeah. I fucking loved those books, mm-hmm. and I'm still trying to understand quite why. Mm-hmm. And there was something about it that was so immediate and unvarnished, and some, even though it was maybe aggrandizing in some ways, it was also just like embarrassing in other ways. And I was attracted to that kind of vulnerability and immediacy mm-hmm. in the writing. I think that that's it's not exactly a novel. Those books aren't. And I want to say, like, in a similar way, like War and Peace isn't exactly a novel. It sort of kind of goes and goes. It's not one thing follows another.
Absolutely
it's
not.
aimed at a huge question. And it's almost like the main character, Peter, wanders through the world and sees all of the things. It's everything you're taught not to do. You know what I mean? Like, don't be a passive observer of your own life, especially if you're going to write a protagonist that way. But he does change. But it's like, I want to say, okay, Mr. Peanut was more formally, and it broke from traditions in some ways that Playworld doesn't. And that's what, so how do you see yourself fitting in with that larger question? Is it interesting to you? That's enough.
Okay. That is a gigantic question.
Yes,
which doesn't mean it isn't a good question. It's just so gigantic. So I'm just going to
parse it down into like, why did you choose to write Playworld the way you did? Maybe that's a simpler way to.
Gosh, I'm still going to come at it from a different angle. Great. I'm going to say this about, because I haven't read the NASCAR books, but I've certainly, but I have read books that are kind of in that vein, by which I mean the books that drift toward or resemble what we call autofiction, whether it's the Rachel Cusk trilogy or which I think those books are magnificent, and also Edward St. Aubyn's like remarkable quintet, Patrick Melrose novels. Certainly in a lot of memorable fiction today, the seeming membrane between autobiography and fiction is more porous than ever. But that just to me is like one mode of fiction writing. I think like great artists like St. Aubyn or Cusk have found that taking settings which very much resemble their lives and giving them all of their diction and powers of narrative, supercharge those settings and give them meaning. So that's just one thing. But putting my Sewanee Review editor hat on, the way I sort of think more about, because I will swing back to answering your question about Playworld, thinking more about fiction today, it was really interesting when I took over the Sewanee Review, because the Sewanee Review, when I took over, this was 2016, it was really on life support, and it was really kind of frozen in amber, and it was responding critically and in some ways including material, not all of it by any stretch of the imagination, but that had different assumptions about what the breadth, content, and the subjects of literary art could be, right? Mm-hmm. And in a lot of ways, literature from that era was organized, as I like to say, vertically. There were these great artists that transferred art downwards. Mm-hmm. And so, pick your white male or your, women literary giants. But there were these few people like up in the Empyrean, up on Mount Olympus, right? Mm-hmm. And the amazing thing about taking over a magazine like the Sewanee Review over the last over 8 years now is that, to me, literature is organized horizontally. Mm. Literature right now is more polyphonic than ever. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's beautiful.
And so, you could just, you could just name names, whether it's, Katie Kitamura, Danielle Evans, or Sadiq Fofana, or Aro Kwan, or, whomever. You know what I mean? Like, I'm just throwing out names. I could throw out hundreds of names. I could just pull out the table of contents of the Sewanee Review. Mm-hmm. So because the field is horizontal, there's this breadth of voices, which is so different, I think, than the way in which the culture used to transmit literature and who the culture admitted into the house of literature. And that makes it actually like a really wonderful and vibrant time. What was I trying to do in Playworld? I've been asked the question like, well, did you have any models for Playworld? And I didn't. Mm-hmm. Like, you mentioned James Salter earlier, and I do think, I don't want to seem grandiose when I say this, but it's just like, I didn't have some kind of, I wasn't trying necessarily to write a big book. Like I said, like I went into this book thinking it was like a tight 3-act structure, and it was going to be this propulsive, like, much shorter book. But the novel that I did have in my mind, at least in terms of its modus operandi, was Saul Bellows' The Adventures of Augie March.
Mm-hmm. I wrote him down as Saul Bellows, like authors that Ross reminds me of.
Well, and yeah,
Russo is another one. Richard Russo.
Yeah, sure. And why? Because in The Adventures of Augie March, and I've studied my Bellow, and he was a big influence early in my early 20s. I've read. I'm a Bellow completist. Mm-hmm. Bellow's first two novels, Dangling Man and The Victim, were these like tight little exercises in this like very small frame, these very like tight dramatic situations. In Dangling Man, a guy's getting ready to go off to war, and it's sort of his journal in these months before he goes off to war. And The Victim is about, it's kind of, again, it's like a doppelganger story where this guy is sort of in conversation with a guy who he finds out for a slight is trying to take revenge on him. And they're very Flaubertian, and they're very like strict realist. And then in Augie March, basically Bellow was kind of like, I ain't being me. You know what I mean? And he just lets the floodgates open, and he gives his characters and the world he's trying to remember, the Chicago of his childhood and the Chicago of his early adulthood, his full-throated artistic capacity. And it doesn't surprise me it was his third book, because he was less concerned in that book with formal control. It's a very craggy book. Mm-hmm. It's like, it has some of the most astonishing moments in it that you'll ever read, right? But I mean, it has its long stretches like a Moby Dick does. But he didn't care. He was just going at it full bore. Mm. And I did want to write something that, if I was going to, take certain aspects of my own experience and distill them down into something that had a dramatic arc, I wanted to pour all of my sort of full-throated ability at this moment in my career into that. I mean, I would say the other book that I was thinking a lot about was Lolita, but I was trying to basically, one of the amazing things about Lolita is you always see Lolita in these terribly tragic moments through the scrim of Humbert's like ecstatic, gorgeous language. And those glimpses of her are horrifying because she's
a kid.
She's having a rough time.
Yeah.
And I wanted to write from that side. But there's a way in which Nabokov in that book, as a person for whom English was his second language,
third, I think,
or okay,
Russian, French.
I'm sorry,
yeah.
Third. Thank you.
Insane.
And by the way, only a writer seeing English from the outside in could write a book of English that beautiful. It's the same with Joseph Conrad. Mm. But anyway, my point here is that like I just wanted to make it as beautiful as possible. I just wanted, I don't consider myself a maximalist, but I wanted it to be, because Matt, we can parse that term, but I just wanted it to be, I wanted to just make it as gorgeous as I could, because, it's very personal.
Yes. I was waiting for the because it's like, one last brief series of questions, which are of the application of the writer's life bit. This took 10 years to write.
Yeah.
You're raising children in the meantime. You're editing
The Swanee Review.
And
Still
life is busy. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
While this is going on, you're juggling all these plates. Are you, while you're in the thick of it, are you writing every day? Are you getting to it when you can? Do you have a rhythm? Are you a morning person?
I'm so glad you asked this, because this will help you, Corby, with your first draft. So I don't see, the thing is that like some people write through, I think I saw Claire Gibson on this show, and she talked about how like Danny Shapiro, who I've published, who's also, I love Danny. I love her work. Was like, okay, here's my advice to you, like take, print out your first draft and then like trash the document, which is a way of like not being wedded to, to free you up. I don't write like that. Like I stop if I don't know what I'm doing, and then I mull. But one thing I did, which was a complete deviation, so I write on the computer, but one thing I did that is a complete deviation from what I did from my normal approach was I got so tired of waiting to get to the other emotional coordinate that I told you about, was that I shifted at a crucial moment, and this is like years ago, I shifted to longhand for a while. And I was just like, I'm going to write through to these moments without any care for cleaning up, like the crows and Hansel and Gretel, like the blackbirds and Hansel and Gretel. I ain't cleaning up my breadcrumbs. I'm just like, I'm going to go. And so I had, I would just force myself for time, like for 3 hours in the morning. I get up very early for 3 hours in the morning to just go like a rocket. And then I had hired an undergraduate who was off for the summer, and she would freaking transcribe my crazy hieroglyphic illegible cuneiform. She was kind of amazing. And give it back to me. And so what happened, it speeded up the process because I was ready to freaking kill myself. I was like, I can't. So that was part of it, which was, again, like being willing to try new things in the process. But, there's a line in Mr. Peanut that holds true for me. I wish it didn't, which is the middle is long and hard. And in that David Pepin, the main character, is talking about marriage. The middle of marriage is long and hard. But he's also writing a novel, and the middle of writing a novel is long and hard. And I just needed it. There was just a certain point where I was like, okay, if I don't I could die. I'm not. So it was just a way of blasting through.
What was the point at which you sold the 70-page treatment? How long ago was that?
That was 2014.
Okay, yeah. So you've been ready to be done for a minute, and then when did you finally?
I finished. The part that finishing Playworld in the closest form it looks like, I finished over a year ago. Mm-hmm. I finished the actual draft, which came in at like 224,000 words. That was like 2 years ago.
How many is this?
That's almost like 190. We cut over 30,000
That's
words.
I feel like that's so encouraging, and hearing you talk about the long form element of it. Why is it encouraging? Because I think it's good advice to overwrite, knowing you're going to cut.
I'm an overwriter. Mm-hmm. I would much rather. I find it. There's a great word from Melville that I learned, which is when you remove blubber from a whale. Do you know what it's called?
No.
It's called flensing. And so there's, it's like time to flense the blubber. like we're flensing the blubber from the whale.
There's another Melville quote that I carry with me everywhere I go to laugh at myself, and also just like note that this is very true, which is it's from Moby Dick. There are some enterprises in which a careful disorderliness is the true method, and he's talking about flensing blubber, and I can imagine the whales fastened to the side of the ship and how chaotic and disgusting.
Are you kidding?
That must have been.
Are you kidding?
That is so. That's your novel.
I'm sorry, man. That's how it works.
Yeah.
It ain't pretty. You know what I mean? And which again goes back to where we were earlier about the only thing you learn is how to finish. I mean, mm-hmm. It's like, you're just, Nabokov had a great quote about this, which was. I think it took him 5 years to write Lolita, and by the way, to all the writers out there, this is my favorite Nabokov story. He was carrying, Nabokov would write in he would use a shoebox, and he would write on flashcards, and so he'd be like, I'm going to write this scene, and this scene sort of takes place kind of in the last third of the book, and I'm going to write this scene, and this scene takes place in the beginning, and he'd loosely chronologically order the shoebox of index cards, and then he'd take all the cards out and write through he'd write the connective tissue through the sketched out scenes, right?
Physically with the cards,
yeah. It'd be like, okay, the beginning, and then he'd do the mm-hmm. right. He was carrying that shoebox to the incinerator at one point, Lolita, which to me, as a piece of prose in the English language, is one of the most remarkable pieces of prose in the English language, right? And so that guy writing that, Cormac McCarthy nearly abandoned Blood Meridian. Took like a year off from it because it was killing him. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like he couldn't find the through line. And so again, but again, how do you learn how to finish a book? By finishing a book. You're just, but the quote I was going to include by Nabokov was, he said, the greatest pain of, of writing this book was living with unfinished things in my workshop. You know what I mean? And, again, it's like, because when you're writing a novel, your workshop is always messy. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. You don't clean up the workshop at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. At least that's not how I operate. I'm going down a wormhole here, but then there's like one of my other favorite, God, I wish I could do it this way, but Don DeLillo, I don't know if you know his process, but he works off of an old regular typewriter, bap, 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 bap. But so what he'll do is he'll put in a piece of paper and he'll write a paragraph. It doesn't matter how short. And then he'll take it out, make some edits, put it in there, and then he'll put another piece of paper and then write the next paragraph. Pop, pop, pop. And it could be just a line of dialogue.
Wow.
Make the edits, and again, so just as, you only learn how to finish a novel by finishing a novel, this is where, as a guy who publishes a craft essay in every issue of the Swanning Review, craft is not necessarily transferable. Like so much, again, for the apprentice writers out there, so much of what you're doing is figuring out your process. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's probably applicable in every form of art. You're just figuring out how your mind operates. I'd love to be faster, and I've written certain things very fast. Mm-hmm. But by the way, I wrote the last 3 chapters of Playworld in like a month. So like once I knew what I was doing, I was it was full afterburners. But it just took me a long time to figure that out.
Well, you've been very generous with your time, and before I turn you loose out into the world to collect your laurels and be the celebrated author that you deserve to be with this book, I thought maybe I could get you to read little passage.
That'd be great.
And I marked it. It's the 2. I think that's probably the better one. And maybe you could set this up, or I can set it up, but I think you'd set it up better.
I'll set it up. So go from 1 to 2?
No, go to 2. Go from 2 to that little break.
Okay, so this is from a chapter. It's the opening of part 2 in the novel. Part 2 of the novel is called The Reagan Administration, and this is the chapter called The Swimsuit Issue. And it's really Griffin meditating on the particular kind of actor his father is. His father is not an actor in the sense that we normally recognize. His father's a really gifted musical actor, and his father's a really gifted narrator. And Griffin and his family go to see his father perform in Josh Logan's Musical Moments. Josh Logan, the great film and musical director, and Logan invites them home to his townhouse, and they ride in his limousine together. And this is Josh Logan, who I did get to spend some time with because my father did perform for him. This is Logan telling Griffin why his dad is such a great singer. Okay. After the show's final performance, Logan invited our family to his townhouse for a nightcap. Mom declined. Orrin was too tired. Dad and I rode with Logan and Netta in his stretch limousine. Logan's tux hung on him loosely, as if he'd recently lost a great deal of weight. He was jowly and had a thick mustache. He grew his remaining hair long and combed it back. When he addressed me, it was clear that the person to whom he was really speaking was Dad. "Would you like to know why your father is a great singer?" Logan said to me. "Because he possesses the 3 most important qualities a singer can have. First, articulation. He makes you hear every word in the lyric, which allows for emphasis and a wider range of interpretation. Second, magnitude. The very bigness of his sound, its unquestionable authority, demands you listen. And finally, he pressed his pinky to his thumb and held up 3 fingers. Storytelling. Your father makes every song answer the following question. Why is this night different from all other nights? My father, so guileless in his admiration of Logan, appeared childlike. He was so thrilled to be here, so close to this God, that he seemed to have forgotten I was present. Our roles, son and father, were reversed, and at such times, observing his wonder at having made it, at least this far, seated as he was across from such a legend, I felt happiest for him and completely invisible.
Adam Ross, congratulations on this fine book.
Thank you so much.
I wish you every good thing in 2025. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for watching. Go ahead and click here to like and subscribe. You can click right there to watch another video, or click here to watch a playlist featuring songs of the Morse Code podcast. Okay, thank you very much.